Hello and welcome to the Week 5 World History video. Hope everyone was able to stay dry and safe during the tropical storm this weekend. But we're going to get into a couple of issues this week. We're still, of course, looking at early Renaissance period, primarily in Europe. And whereas we ended last week talking about Leonardo da Vinci and, of course, his wonderful paintings and all the other great things he did, we're going to start off this week with someone pretty much just as famous as him and a contemporary of da Vinci's. You've most definitely heard the name of Michelangelo, or Michelangelo. Both pronunciations are proper. He was, much like da Vinci, born in Italy, showed lots of promise at a very early age, and also like da Vinci, he began his career as an apprentice, learning under a master, in this case Ghirlandaio, who was not only a painter but also a sculptor. And again, much like da Vinci, he really put himself into his apprenticeship, and he moved eventually after, remember, da Vinci spent 13 years in his apprenticeship. Michelangelo only spent about 3 before he moved to the workshop of Bertoldo di Giovanni. And his studio happened to be a part of the Medici Gardens. De Medici, of course, the family that ruled Florence at this time. And this garden was filled with Greek and Roman statues. So once again, we get another Renaissance artist who is very, very heavily influenced by the so-called classical arts, ancient Greece and Rome. Michelangelo became a good painter, great one as it will turn out, but keep this in mind, he never really liked painting. He sort of tolerated it. He was supposed to do it. He was expected to do it. Sculpture is where he showed his greatest early interest, and he caught the eye of our old friend Lorenzo de' Medici, again, the grandson of Cosimo, again, ruler of Florence, and very, very conspicuous patron of the arts. He invited Michelangelo to live at his home, paid him a modest salary, and again, because the de' Medici family was very much shaped by the classical art of the Greeks and the Romans, Michelangelo, again, adopted that. He created his 2 most famous statues very early in his career. He was still in his 30s, and it brought him lots of recognition. Again, lots of times artists are not remembered or appreciated or even regarded until long after they're dead. Michelangelo's sculptures in particular were very, very popular during his lifetime, so he was able to financially reap some of the rewards from them. The first masterpiece was the Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica, and it's a deeply moving piece portraying Christ after his death, lying across the lap of his mother Mary. She is wearing a very, very highly detailed robe, and it is a very moving piece of sculpture. You can just see the sorrow in Mary's face as she gazes down upon her son who's just been crucified. You can almost hear Jesus whispered to her, "It is finished." It's a very emotional piece of sculpture. And again, you'll notice some of the Renaissance traits here. Very, very lifelike. Very much a nod to the Greeks and the Romans. His most famous statue would come a little bit later, and it is simply known as David. It was created in Florence, an 18-foot nude replica of King David that is so lifelike it looks like it's breathing when you look at it. The way David is positioned in this sculpture, the right side is firm and steadfast, supposedly to represent the strength of David the man under the guidance of God. His left side is relaxed and almost unguarded, reflecting the very human weaknesses that we know King David had. Michelangelo, I think I said he was in his early 30s when he did this. He was still only 27 when he completed David. And he lived a life where he knew the weaknesses of mankind. Michelangelo was very, very temperamental, very much into drinking and carousing. He was not living a very Christian life as he was making this incredible art. It was about this time that he was asked to work with Da Vinci on a battle scene for the cathedral in Florence. And much like Da Vinci, again, it's impossible not to compare these two because they are contemporaries. They were both in Italy and both alive at about the same time. Like Da Vinci, he was fascinated with the human body and movement in the body. Just the little details about the way humans move. He was always very interested in that. Like Da Vinci, he also studied cadavers, dead bodies, to learn more about the human body. Again, the church didn't like this very much, but as just a naturally curious artist, he wanted to literally see what made us tick. Unlike Leonardo, Michelangelo practically ignored landscapes in his paintings. He did not do too many still portraits like that. He didn't do like Da Vinci did and play with perspective. He was very much subject-oriented. The Pope at this time was Julius II, and he was basically just like Michelangelo in that he was ill-tempered, stern, a little bit arrogant, and he initially commissioned Michelangelo to design a magnificent burial tomb for him. They got into a disagreement over the way the tomb was going to look, and it really was more than a disagreement. It was a shouting battle, and both prideful men, they could not agree on what Michelangelo was to do. Well, Julius then came up with the idea of commissioning Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of what's called the Sistine Chapel. It's a private chapel within the Vatican, only used for, or at the time only used for, small ceremonies. If you walk into the Sistine Chapel today, the ceilings are very high, but the size, the number of people you can seat in there is less than 70, really. It's not a big place width-wise, but the ceiling, of course, is very high. And, of course, the ceiling is now what everyone's looking at. Michelangelo, according to the stuff he wrote, he needed the money at the time. Very practical concern. He was also concerned that the Pope would excommunicate him because he was so angry at him from their earlier tiff. And so he begrudgingly agreed to do this. And, wow, he had to paint 10,000 square feet of space from 70 feet off the ground. That's how high the ceilings are here. A process that took more than 4 years. He would literally lie on his back on scaffolding while painting these wonderful scenes, and he just became so, like a lot of artists will, he just became so engrossed in the work, he would just, not sleep for days while painting. He would not eat meals. There's stories of him not going to the bathroom, except for the obvious ways while he was up there. But the results, of course, are absolutely breathtaking. 343 different figures he drew, most of them very muscle-bound figures. He was very fond of drawing humans in a very flattering light. There's no ugly humans. They were all, classically beautiful. And it portrayed God, the creator of the universe, as a gray-bearded man floating in the heavens. And quite frankly, that image of God that is probably the most common image, that of an old, white-haired, white-bearded, it was greatly influenced by Michelangelo's depictions of God. Now, there were other depictions of God earlier. Some sects of Christianity thought it was immodest to paint a portrait of God. You see all the Christian religious iconic art from the Middle Ages, very few depictions of God, mostly Jesus and other saints, Paul and whatnot, but very few, if any, of God. Michelangelo's depictions probably played more into what's now the popular visual image of God as an old guy with a beard and all that jazz. Most every figure is shown to be in action, doing something. One of the most famous parts of the Sistine Chapel is God reaching out towards the hand of Adam. And that's one of the most parodied, I guess, but one of the most memorable pictures. The Creation of Man, that segment is called. And there's others portraying the fall of Adam and Eve, sinners in the flood, David beating Goliath. There's no landscape in any of this, just multitudes of faces and bodies flying in midair as though they're on the ceiling there. And I have talked to people who have been to the Sistine Chapel to see it, and they all sort of say the same thing. It's impossible to describe. You have to be there. You have to see it. Pictures don't do it justice. Well, the pictures that we're seeing here most definitely are breathtaking. Michelangelo's, most of his final years were spent in Rome. In his late 50s, he returned to Rome and developed a friendship with a woman named Vittoria Colonna. It was a platonic friendship, but he was very, very devoted to her, and evidently was the first time in his life that he ever really cared for another human being outside of himself, and it really changed him. He had never made much time for friends or family before that. And you see in his work sort of this inner struggle. This guy who is maturing and finally figuring out that, all of the things I've been chasing after all my life, I should have been chasing after, meaningful relationships with other people. He went back to the Sistine Chapel and painted a scene called The Last Judgment, and it tells visually a very sobering story. It portrays the folly of man's sin and the ultimate consequences of those sins. Michelangelo even painted himself as an obscure image in this picture. When his friend Vittoria died in 1547, Michelangelo just had unbearable grief. From that point on, in the remaining few years of his life, he did nothing but religious imagery and iconic drawings. Unlike Leonardo, Michelangelo is probably less an example of the Renaissance man because he was not as widely varied as Da Vinci, but his art included some of the most indelible images and really defined the Renaissance period and really defined Western civilization. So Michelangelo, again, just looking at what we can see today, it's definitely worth your while. We're going to go a little bit north for the next lesson and look at just a few painters of what was called the Northern Renaissance. Again, Florence, Italy is the part of the world where we cite as the birthplace of the Renaissance. But a little bit further north, up in modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, there were some very interesting artists at work who, in one case, really predated the Renaissance. The one that really predated the end of the Renaissance was Jan van Eyck from Flanders, a Flemish painter. He was born actually in 1390, and so he's a 14th, 15th century guy, so he's a little bit, couple generations ahead of the spark of the Renaissance in Florence. His paintings, probably the most famous of which is this one, the Arnolfini Marriage. It's just a husband and wife holding hands in a room surrounded by details that really tell us more about everyday life in the 14th century. Again, one of the things about history is most of the history we know are the history of kings and popes and great leaders because that's what people were writing about. Very few people were writing about the common folk, what they did on a day-to-day basis. And just this one wonderful painting from Jan van Eyck gives us just a little glimpse into what the simple folk were doing at this time. It puts in a convex mirror in the middle of the painting to give it play around with perspective a little bit. And you'll see, like you see in the Renaissance paintings that came later, this great example of realism. Again, the faces are just striking. They just jump out at you. And Jan van Eyck died 10 years before Leonardo was born, so there's no way he could have been influenced by Da Vinci. Suffice to say that Jan van Eyck was way ahead of his time. A little bit later, around the mid-15th century, Hieronymus Bosch, sometimes known as Jerome Bosch, was born. And he kept up the Flemish tradition of putting great detail into his work. And He had a macabre edge about him. It's Halloween month, so we can start talking about spooky stuff, I guess. He had weird and horrifying creatures in his paintings, all shapes and sizes, depicting torment and doom. He was a very dark soul, evidently. He depicted hell as what is supposed to be a pretty scary place. Another painting of his Ship of Fools. He pokes fun at man's foolishness. And he was actually, because, there was lots of realism in there, but again, a lot of these exaggerated, almost monstrous figures makes people who study art history trace him as one of the ancestors of the 19th and 20th century surrealist movement, people like Salvador Dali, because a lot of the things in a Bosch painting were just fantastical, almost mythical type creatures. And so he was very influential on so-called traditional artists and on so-called avant-garde artists for centuries after. Another artist from the Northern Renaissance we'll mention is Albrecht Dürer, who was a painter and engraver who lived in Germany and was really the founder of Renaissance art in Germany. He was to Germany what Leonardo da Vinci was to Italy, basically. Matter of fact, he went to Italy to learn under some of the Renaissance masters of the time. His most famous painting is a very simple one. It's a pair of praying hands. It looks about like you would expect. But the detail that he included in his painting, again, more realism, and just the striking figure, a very simple pose, praying hands, but it just jumps out the page at you. The legends go that these were his brother's hands, a brother who agreed to work in the mines so Albrecht could go study art. And so if you think about it from that standpoint, it gives the praying hands a little bit more meaning, much deeper meaning. Again, like Van Dyck, his other images captured the peasants, the common people, showing us here today just a glimpse of what life was like at that time. The last Northern Renaissance artist we'll mention is Peter Bruegel the Elder. His most famous painting was the Tower of Babel, which, again, it hits on the realism, but again, it also hits on, if you look down on the lower left-hand side, these were the people building it. These were the common folks. Again, no kings or queens here, just a look into life in the 15th century, or the 16th century in this case. We're going to close out this week talking about another Renaissance artist, but not a painter, a writer, someone who is, for me personally, one of the more interesting characters, one I can probably identify with the most. He went by one name. His first name was Desiderius, but his last name was Erasmus. Everyone knows him as Erasmus. He was born in Italy, born in the Netherlands in 1469, but he moved out very early. His parents died at a young age. He actually joined a monastery, which will seem kind of funny after you hear more about the way he was. He was an Augustinian monk. He didn't like fasting. He didn't like praying. He didn't like sacrificing things during Lent. So, as you can tell, he was going to probably make a poor priest, even though he was ordained as a priest. 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for America. He immersed himself as a monk. One of the things about being a monk is you're going to have copies or access to literature, which was very unusual. And he just immersed himself in reading. And again, a lot of his reading was the classics, Greek and Roman writings. He was semi-commissioned by the church, not really, but he did it anyway, to update the Latin Vulgate. Remember, the Vulgate is the Bible that had been used by the Catholic Church for, about 1,000 years at this point. And there was a movement that, again, very few people were speaking Latin at this point. They didn't want him to put it into common language. That's a whole other controversy. We've talked about what happens to what the church did with people who tried to translate the Bible into a so-called common language like German or Italian. But they just wanted to update it. There were errors in the Vulgate translation from the original Greek and Aramaic and whatnot. And they wanted Jerome, was the one who first translated the Vulgate. They wanted Erasmus to sort of update it. Well, he did, And his updates were very controversial in some cases. Is the new edition criticized Erasmus for not applying the Word of God to his personal life. Again, those in the church that commissioned him to do this saw the errors and said, well, what do you expect from a guy of such low moral character? Well, Erasmus kept reading and writing more. He tutored students to pay for more books and whatnot. His next big work was called the Adagia, and it was very possible. It provided a crash course in the classics for those wanting to keep up with the Renaissance. And it was very popular. Again, much like Michelangelo, Erasmus's writings were enough to pay the bills, which is very unusual for an artist. As you probably know, artists for most of history, especially at this time, were only able to work insofar as they had patrons. They worked for a king or a duke or the church or somebody that paid for their art. Without a patron, it would be very difficult for them to put food on the table. Erasmus was very popular and was able to work without a patron. He was a free agent. He had offers from the Vatican, from kings and others, but he chose to be a free agent, and I respect the heck out of that. I'm someone that owns a small business and knows what it's like to stick your neck out with working without a net. And very few people were full-time writers back then, but it seemed to work. Kept busy traveling, and again, because he was a free agent, he could write as much or as little as he wanted, and he could write what he wanted. And what he wanted was to be sort of a curmudgeon critic of society at large. And that came out in a work called In Praise of Folly. Some people loved it, some people hated it, but to better understand it, you need to know that it was satire. Satire is a literary device where you poke fun at something by showing it for all of its silliness. Mark Twain was a satirist. Erasmus did this in Praise of Folly. He poked fun at some people, which is why they didn't like it, because they were the ones being made fun of. Folly is the name of a female character who represents all of mankind. Erasmus starts with amusing remarks about grammarians, grammar Nazis. He makes fun of them, and writers like himself. So he self-satire. He said, a lot of writers take themselves too seriously. He then goes on to slam merchants, lawyers, and philosophers for their greed and ego. By the end of the book, he is absolutely ridiculing the behavior of just about everyone else, and he saved his strongest venom for the church. Again, we talked about the moral shape the church had gotten into at this point. He lashed out at evil priests, immoral monks, greedy popes. He lampooned or satirized the practice of indulgences. We talked about that in our last history course. That was basically where you could pay to forgive your sins. You give enough money, and the church would print you up a sheet of paper that basically said you're good with the Lord. You're going to go to heaven, even though you sinned. It was, of course, this is not the way forgiveness works at all. But the church was doing it, and Erasmus was among those who pointed out that, number one, it's silly. Number two, it's just wrong. As it turned out, Erasmus's criticism, even though it was done in a satirical way, was pretty spot on. A lot of his targets really deserved to be satirized. Our old friend Pope Julius II, who criticized or who got Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, he was one of the most indulgent popes there was. That is to say, he sold the most indulgences, and he did not like Erasmus writing about the church in this manner. A couple of other notes about Erasmus. He also wrote the Handbook of a Christian Knight, he called it, and oddly enough, he urged Christians to return to the moral teachings of Christ and encouraged acts of charity. Sounds like a good deal. The problem was, I don't know if it's a problem or not, Erasmus was not really a Christian by his own admission. He was a humanist. Again, we talked about the difference between humanism and Christianity, or humanism and religion. Humanism is a focus on man, what man can do, what man is capable of. To be in a religion, the focus is not on man, it's on God, or whatever that replacement is in what your religion is. Erasmus promoted Christ as a good role model, but not God made flesh. Erasmus, by his own admission, was not sure he was a Christian, but he encouraged people to follow the teachings of Jesus because he found great value in the words that Jesus said. Erasmus, by his writings, was pretty impressed with the rate of mankind's achievements at this time. Again, the Renaissance is starting to pick up steam, and Erasmus, as really the foremost writer of the period, wrote lots that praised the advancements that were going on. There was something else stirring across Europe, and Erasmus helped light the fuse for this. Reformation of the Church. We're going to hear a lot more about that as we come along, as the Renaissance kicks into second gear, and you can make a very, very strong case that the Protestant Reformation was at least partially fueled by the writings of Erasmus, In Praise of Folly, which had its greatest venom targeted at the church, was most certainly influential in guiding Martin Luther to do what he would do a bit later. The church banned all of Erasmus's books 23 years after his death, because at that time the Protestant Reformation was well underway, and they were using Erasmus's writings as some of their fuel. Anyway, we'll talk more about these fine folks come Monday. We'll see you then.